Thank you very much for all your comments. And one sticks out who says, in fact, two stick out that say that I am prejudiced or biased in favour of the British MPs, and I'm not giving sufficient coverage of the Israeli position. Well, this is, I think, ironic given the fact that my thumbnail was a photograph drawn from the Jewish Chronicle. So let's just go back over this story and look at it from a purely Israeli point of view. As two British MPs, Abtissam Mohammed and Yuan Yang, attempted to visit the West Bank on a fact-finding mission. And while this episode was brief in duration, it opens a window into Israel's increasingly muscular border policy, especially concerning critics of its military conduct. Mohammed and Yang, elected only last year, wanted to visit the occupied West Bank as part of what they described as a humanitarian delegation to see the situation on the ground to meet UK-affiliated aid groups. However, they were stopped at the Ben Gurion airport and ultimately deported. And according to Israeli authorities, they were not travelling on a verified parliamentary delegation, and their past remarks had crossed the line, in the words of Israeli diplomats. So what exactly did Israel claim? The Interior Ministry, backed by statements from the Israeli embassy in London, alleged that the MP's trip was intended to provoke anti-Israeli activities, including spreading hateful rhetoric and supporting campaigns such as boycotts and sanctions against the state and its ministers. The Interior Minister Moshe Arbel invoked Israeli law to bar their entry, saying that the pair had falsely claimed parliamentary status and intended to harm Israel and its citizens. Israel further argumented that the timing of the trip, when Israel is embroiled in a multi-front conflict, rendered the visit provocative and politically loaded. The embassy statement was blunt: Israel will not allow entry to those who seek its delegitimization under the guise of democracy. Back in London, the response was swift and indignant. Foreign Secretary David Lammy condemned the detention and the removal of the MPs as unacceptable and counterproductive. Labour friends of Israel, usually sympathetic to Israel's position, called the decision wrong. Emily Thornberry accused Israel of alienating allies rather than fostering understanding. And even Keir Starmer's camp, typically cautious on Middle Eastern matters, expressed discomfort. But there was a political divide. Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative opposition leader, the party leader, offered a more sympathetic reading of Israel's decision. She suggested that sovereign nations have a right to guard their borders and questioned the judgment of MPs who, she argued, had promoted misinformation in Westminster debates. Mohammed and Yang are not neutral observers. Mohammed has repeatedly accused Israel of ethnic cleansing in Gaza and supports a boycott of goods from Israeli settlements. Yang, a former economist, journalist, has called for sanctions on Israeli ministers and criticised Israeli restrictions on journalists and Palestinian contributors. Both signed letters condemning Israel's settlement policy and urging the UK to ban imports from these regions. From Israel's perspective, then, these are not mere backbenchers on a study tour. They were vocal critics viewed, fairly or not, as partisan actors in a highly charged conflict. But my position is that this is still insulting behaviour from Israel to the Parliament, to the British Parliament, and that this was an opportunity for them to put their case. This isn't an isolated case. Israel has previously denied entry to European and American lawmakers. In February, a European Parliament delegation cancelled its trip after two MEPs were barred. In 2019, the Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib were famously refused entry under similar allegations of support for the BDS movement. So Israel's stance is consistent. It treats the border as a site of ideological defence as much as security, and critics call this authoritarian and censoring. Defenders argue it's a rational response to campaigns against Israel masquerading as parliamentary inquiry. What's changed is not Israel's assertiveness, it's the diplomatic cost it's willing to absorb. In the past, such MPs might have been quietly tolerated. Now, Israel appears more willing to risk alienating Western allies, particularly left-leaning legislators, if they are seen to undermine Israel's legitimacy. This marks a shift from hasbara, Israel's traditional approach of winning hearts and minds, to broader denial and direct confrontation. It's less about persuading critics than about marginalizing them. But it comes at a reputational cost. Refusing entry to elected MPs can backfire by creating the very headlines that we've seen in the last couple of days that Israel seeks to avoid. It risks reinforcing the perception, especially among young, left-leaning Western voters, that Israel has something to hide. So the barring of Mohammed and Yang is not just a diplomatic spat, but a symptom of deeper fractures between Israel and Western progressives, between security and transparency, between wartime governance and liberal norms. In the battle of narratives, the border is now the front line, and Israel is making it very clear who gets to cross. I think in this case, Israel is wholly wrong, but I'm certainly not ignoring Israel's position. In fact, I've read up on it, and I've looked intensely at the sources, though there are very few Israeli sources on this subject at the moment, and a lot of Israeli newspapers seem to be ignoring the subject, which is interesting, and I suppose in its own way also telling.